Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As promised the last time you saw us, we'll be interviewing the author of A Stranger in the Citadel, Tobias Buckell. Welcome, Tobias,
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you.
as always. So, last week we started our discussion by focusing on the type of novel this is, the genre of the novel. So, I suppose we could start by talking about the protagonist. Why did you choose to tell this story from the perspective of a very young protagonist?
That's such a good question. And I actually have a decent answer to this, but it's a less satisfying answer. This is one of those rare moments of just a character coming to me. So the idea for this book kind of came out of the just ether, right? Not often do I believe in kind of like, ideas just dropping onto you out of nowhere. But in this case, I just always had an idea of kind of this spunky, young, almost princess who was discovering that they were part of the problem, that they were part of the system, and that this sort of royal spoiled life, it's, kind of a Rudyard Kipling, the colonial writer, did Captain's Courageous about the spoiled little kid who gets tossed off the side of a boat. He gets picked up by a fishing vessel. It's a working vessel. And he's like, take me back to port. And they're like, no, we've got a route to run. We've got fish to catch, cargo to deliver. And we're just going to make you a deckhand. And that hard work is going to make you a man. So for this, it was just sort of like that traumatic experience that propels her into adulthood and like a greater realization of what the world really is that she's living in was what I wanted to write about. So kind of like a classic Bildungsroman, a coming of age story. So it always was this character in my head for some reason. It just arrived as that person's story. And I just kind of ran it from there.
Is this a YA novel?
That's a good question. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I can see why people would think so, but the problems she faces are incredibly adult. However, I do think it can be read by young adult readers, but it wasn't meant to be a YA novel, if that makes any sense. So it doesn't use a lot of the conventions that modern YA novels use. And it's using different, it's in a different conversation. So I wouldn't say it's YA, but I'm sure it's read by many people of high school age. And I hope people do read it at that age because I think it's got some interesting things to say.
I mean, I've really struggled with the character at first. I think I was wondering if I was going to feel sorry for this poor little rich girl. So I'm really interested to hear. Yeah, like I was really conflicted for a lot of the early novel for that reason. Actually,
Yeah.
it was wonderful. And one of the things I found really remarkable, actually, was speaking of genre, was kind of how you wove together a number of different genres that we don't necessarily put together, right? So this novel has contemporary, it's kind of a contemporary cautionary tale. It's a thriller, which is a very compelling thriller. This is one of those books that had me like from the first sentence, I was like, oh, what's going to happen next? It's also dystopian, it's science fiction. Like you said, it's a classic kind of coming of age tale. Is that something that you did deliberately? Is it a novel? It's also a novel of ideas, right? It's also got all these really strong women at the center of it. Is deliberate? Were you consciously writing against genre, or were you attempting to be multi-genred, or is that just your brilliance just on the page when you started with that character?
Well, the character led to a lot of the themes of just sort of coming of age naturally. But the other stuff, the mashing of genres, is something I'm kind of maybe a little bit known for, which is that I love to take this sort of like 10,000 ideas and synthesize something out of it. And I'm very steeped in genre, a lot of genre, because I was like part of that, one of those last generations that grew up without TV, because I was growing up on a boat. And so I didn't encounter a lot of that. I didn't have a TV. So I read a lot. I read a ton. And what I really arrowed into was science fiction. And I really loved all the big idea. I love ideas fiction. So for me, this was a novel that was kind of like one of those classic ideas, science fiction novels I used to love so much when I was a kid. That's just these like mind blowing ideas every page, right? Like when I was young and reading a Bruce Sterling novel, and like he would have some idea on a page that another writer would spin a whole novel out of, or at least a short story. And for him, it was just a throwaway gag in a paragraph. And so that kind of stuff I just love, and wanted to kind of see if I could play at that level of just, let's grab all of these different things I love so much and see if I can synthesize something new and interesting out of it.
It definitely felt that way to me. So thank you.
Yeah.
So, continuing with the discussion. So, in the world of the novel, even in the corrupted space of the Citadel, gender hierarchy does not exist. Why did you create a world in which there was no disadvantage to being a woman?
So because I was like trying to imagine this future without well, in the Citadel, it's problematic because they've captured the device that gives away free food and medicine. But I was trying to imagine this future that had been created where we didn't need to handle housing, medicine, or food. Like, what is that? What does that look like? And it turns out that it looks a lot like early hunter-gatherer society. And so like we have actually gone through a period very similar to that. And when we came out of that into an agricultural society about 12 to 14,000 years ago, is where you start to see genetic drift happening in the Y chromosome, which means that humans are breeding differently. So for patriarchy instead of matriarchy or just whatever, was there before in hunter-gatherer setups. So about 12,000 years ago, basically, is when we seem to have invented patriarchy in connection with the development of agriculture, right? So, if we do away with agriculture, as we did in this novel, what does that mean? I imagine just kind of the collapse of patriarchy because it's seems to be so tied to agriculturalism. Even today, if we look at hunter-gatherer societies, they're not automatically patriarchal. So I just kind of bolted that in as part of the world building because as science fiction writers, when we're trying to build a world, we're trying to kind of look at what we kind of know and apply it to this. But also, I just think like so much fantasy has like these like horrific gender hierarchies. It's like, every novel is just sort of like, yes, there's a very large man who's the king who's now going to do horrible things to women because it's the past and there are dragons. And so like it's okay to also imagine novels in which like none of that happens and there's still dragons. In this case there are no dragons in this fantasy, but it's just like, like we can have one of each maybe. So I just felt that there was just I didn't know what that would bring to this, like bringing that in. So I just thought, like, while we looked at other slices of dystopia, let's not put all the dystopia stuff in there, so that you know um, we had a different thing. That's just what I was trying to create, something different.
I mean, your novel plays a lot with these ideas, right? Of like what's life like without X, Y, or Z thing, because we also have
Right.
two cities that we see up close, the Citadel and I'm going to get the name wrong, Indusi.
Hmm.
Essentially, the two places where in the Citadel there's demagoguery, right? There's absolute power in the hands of this family, but this other city there's this alternative world, right, where everything is shared, where everybody has equal access. It's a really kind of egalitarian vision of what the future could be like. Um, there's a question here coming. I haven't got it. It's left me. Is that important to you? Like, are
Yeah.
you? I think there's something. I think there's something really Caribbean about that approach, though, as a writer, right? It's to choose a different kind of dystopia, like what can be dystopian and what isn't dystopian is very culturally informed.
Right, right. Well, and also like dystopias are complex. So one of the things I loved about teaching one of Ursula K. Le Guin's novels in a science fiction course recently was that she creates this dystopia slash utopia at the same time. There are elements of her society that people still write papers about because they're different than ours, right? More egalitarian, more anarchist. And then there are other aspects of some of the society that are not comfortable and modern and that are regressive, right? So, like, as we're reading this novel, the students were pointing out that, like, oh, this looks really cool, right? And then pointing at other things and saying, oh, that's way worse than here. And so I think one of the reasons Ursula K. Le Guin is still read is that she didn't go full dystopian or full utopian, right? There's like these complexities. And that's what really interested me in teaching some of these pieces. And so when I approached this book, I was kind of thinking back to that a lot, just that I didn't want it to be one thing or another. I wanted it to have complexity because I think that complexity is the part of the human that's so much more human than like the Star Trek world where you land and the whole world is just jungle, right? Like that kind of monoculture. And so even within the culture of any given city, I had like variations of beliefs and variations of reactions and things like that. I just wanted that. I wanted it to feel kind of more lived in, and that's how we get there, I think.
I think that's also why the novel's quite scary in some ways, because it feels very realistic in that sense that there will be a complex future, right? It could have both.
Yeah. I think someone titled it. So this is the root of the word that actually sparked the idea for this. Someone wrote the word heterotopia. It's all kinds of topias happening at the same time, dissing utopia. And they said, we currently live in heterotopia. That's what the world is. There are parts of the world that live in near utopia and parts of the world that live in near dystopia. There's a child digging around in a garbage heap somewhere trying to find like usable AA batteries to salvage out of it, or some metal that they can recycle for scrap, at the same time that there's some kid probably flying around in a private jet making an influencer video for YouTube. Like both of those things exist in this world simultaneously. So like when I'm doing science fiction world building, I'm always looking for things that I can stack on top of each other that are like that, where you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. They have YouTube influencers who can fly in a private jet. At the same time, you're like, and there's this other horrible thing. I think that's how we get at kind of showing something real, is that complexity.
So Tobias actually wanted to focus on a Caribbean example of utopia slash dystopia, depending on the side of the argument that you're on.
You're going to try to get
So
me in trouble.
just a little bit. Some of us saw glimpses of the disintegration of the Grenada Revolution in the novel. In particular, we saw a resemblance between Kira and Bernard Cord. Did the Revo enter your thoughts when you were writing this novel?
So, this is why I talk in the US and the UK a lot about the importance of having people from your own culture and background reading your work. Because it's Caribbean academics and reviewers and readers like you that ask the questions that no one else even knows to ask, right? Um, Look, I was a child during the Revo. I grew up in the aftermath, so it is embedded in my DNA and everything I think about. I can no more escape that seeping into stuff I write than I can, any other foundational childhood experience. That stuff is, you can take me out of the Caribbean, but you can't take those experiences out of me, right? So those are my earliest formative memories. So uh, in my field in science fiction, there's this adoration of the singular hero who can whip up a mob with his mind and the speeches he gives. I mean, think of the success of Dune that just came out recently, right? These sorts of god emperor type figures is rife in the genre, right? I have a much more complicated relationship with those sorts of figures. And your question speaks to why I have this sort of like natural sort of, now let's everyone slow down a second here. He may be the Quetzalcoatl Haderach, but let's just think about some of the implications of what he's saying. Okay, if I'm in the background of Dune, I'm more like the other guys who are suspicious of him as he's like rising a mob up against everyone, right? It's sort of like, okay, this might work, but it might also not work. So Kira's that inflexible demagogue type. She's really good orator, and she's not wrong in her critiques. Uh, and yet at the same time, she's not right in her application necessarily. So yeah, I mean, gosh, almost every demagogue figure I have in my fiction has those complexities within them where I'm kind of like, yeah, their critique is dead on accurate. They're not wrong. And yet, look at all the damage that demagoguery can cause if we're not careful. And boy, if there's one thing we should be careful about, it's, you know, how we as human beings interact with these figures. So it's this tragedy of humanity that we live in a lot of different simultaneous truths, and sometimes we all don't meet them eye to eye. And
You
so,
are
yeah,
really ducking this question, sir. Uh,
yeah, Kira is very much inspired by that childhood experience of the Revo, right? Like, I have family that are on both sides of it, right? So, like, it's really complex, and Grenadians try not to talk about it a lot.
yeah, I didn't get a Bernard Cord figure for Kira. I actually got more of a Eric Gary, but maybe I was reading it wrong. Or maybe you let the reader decide, as you're clearly not going to tell us. But that's fine. That's fine. I will ask a different question.
Yeah.
Um, because I think one thing that you're surely more comfortable talking about is that this novel reads as a critique of AI in quite clearly. I think, unless we've read it really wrong, please tell us if we have. Um, but there's also a subtle critique, I think, of the unwillingness of humans to value learning in its kind of pure sense, not kind of getting exams that they're quite happy with. It's not that. It's about the kind of real critical thinking, like the value that education, the way it can change a life, if you like. I say that as an educator who's quite passionate about
Mm.
the liberatory possibilities of education. Um, in case that wasn't obvious. So I'm going to ask a really silly question, which is, do you have an Alexa at home?
Do I have do I have an Alexa at home? No, I do not. I do have Apple products, so I do. They come with Siri, and now my phone is going to light up. Yep.
How does that work? Like,
uh,
how do you balance that kind of skepticism about AI with kind of the reality of it in our lives already?
Yeah, as a creative, it's horrifying, right? Because all of our works were scraped. I mean, I know for a fact that my novels, Crystal Rain, Ragamuffin, and Sly Mongoose, were scraped into the database, and I think Arctic Rising and Hurricane Fever as well were scraped into those databases and used. So the ability of those things to create fiction comes out of them ripping my copyright. So
Mm.
yeah, I feel very ill disposed towards AI as it's being implemented. As a science fiction writer, I'm incredibly fascinated by the utility of like large language data models for looking at undiscovered connections, right? Like for right now, the most fascinating thing for me is not, what's hitting the headlines in terms of like, oh, look, we're stealing the ability to make art, right? Which is like, right? It's kind of like saying like you should enjoy watching a football game played by robots, right? That's how it feels to me. They're really good football playing robots. You should be impressed. And I'm like, I am, but I don't want to watch footballs. I want to watch robots play football, right? I want to watch like people with backstories and human frailties and like teams that rise and fall due to fate of like bad management, right? Like that's why you watch sports, not because there's a really good robot on the field. That's the same thing with art for me. So it's frustrating to see that. But where I am fascinated is that they recently used AI to start reading the Herculaneum scrolls. So, like next to Pompeii was this other incident where the volcano ash that sifted down into the Roman village was soft and happened over many, many, many days. So it preserved everything just like Pompeii, but it didn't destroy as much. And when in the 1800s they were trying to dig it up, these amateur archaeologists in the Victorian era, they kept finding what they thought were these burnt logs and kind of tossing them aside. And whenever they picked them up, they would just kind of disintegrate into ash. And they realized after a couple of times of breaking them that they weren't logs, that they were papyri, and that what they were excavating was in an ancient library that was even discussed in one of the
Whoa.
old manuscripts, which is a famous library of Herculaneum. They'd found it, but all these scrolls had been burned by the ash. So over the years that we've tried to open them, right? And in the early days, they opened a few of them, trying, and when they got it unrolled just a little bit, they would disintegrate into ash. And they're like, okay, let's stop. Maybe in the future, some better technology will come along and we can unroll it. And so every generation or so, someone gets a scroll, knowing that if they screw up opening it, that scroll is lost for all eternity and we'll never read it. And they try to open it and it falls apart into ash, right? And so finally, now we're into the non-disruptive methods. They're X-raying them to see if they can read text, and they can read just a little bit of text on the outside, and that's it. So we know that they're scrolls and that they're papyri. And what they recently did was they took a neutrino bombardment machine, which shot just millions of neutrinos through. And every time it would hit a little bit of ink, it would wiggle differently than when it hit parchment. And so by capturing all of the neutrinos, the entire digital map of it, they could dump it on AI and say, do you find any connections here? Right? And AI would just sort through just billions and billions of possible meanings of the data and say, this looks promising. And we'd be like, no, that was not. And basically that was able to help us actually for the first time ever digitally unroll in AI and virtual reality one of the scrolls of Herculaneum. We're starting to read them now. But you know what the missing link was? it wasn't AI. It was a dude in, I think, New Zealand who took some of the results that AI was generating and sat there and just looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of images, and he caught something that the AI hadn't. In the static behind all of the nonsense, he started to see what he thought were Roman numerals, just from the static noise, the background, just uselessness. And it's out of that that he was able to start training AI on something he caught. So it's like, I don't, it's not this magic sauce like spell that we can wave. I think it's this powerful tool if we aim it in the right direction at things like decoding the scrolls of Herculaneum that are really cool. But like, yeah, I don't want to watch robots playing soccer on a field. And that's basically what people are proposing. Like, hey, this AI did really great art. I'm like, that art is a human being trying to communicate something to me, not a robot playing soccer. So that's my feeling.
No, I get that. I think the human being playing soccer is a really good image as well, because I think it's about laser saving devices. That's what technology was supposed to provide us with, right? Make
Exactly.
our lives easier, not take over our lives.
I want AI that folds my laundry, right?
I'd like it
That's
that sorts it
useful.
and washes it.
And ironing too. Like, you find me AI that does ironing, that is civilization changing. Not one that produces like really lame kind of like, sparkly, computer generated art. Like, we've got artists that can do that already.
And we have readers who could who could look into text. So my question is along that line.
Okay.
In this novel, you pay tribute to several authors, among them Lewis Carroll, Alexandre Dumas, Langston Hughes, and Edgar Allan Poe. Is this novel a love letter to those authors in particular, or is it a love letter to literature in general?
Both, but those writers really had an impact on this novel, um, because Poe for a little bit of the moodiness, Lewis Carroll for some of the absurdity that I tried to get in there, Langston Hughes because there's a lot more sort of blackness hidden in this novel than people realize. For example, if you ever look up the names of all of the people who live in Nudisea, you'll find out that they're all traditionally, in the novel it mentions, they're all traditional names handed down generation to generation. Those were all the names of the slaves that George Washington kept on his farm in outside of DC, and Washington DC, of course, named for him. So I just have all these little hidden things in there, and that comes from me wanting to pay respects to Hughes, but also Alexandre Dumas, because it's a lot of hidden stuff, because Dumas was biracial. Here's this guy who's biracial. His father was if you ever read this novel, there's a really great nonfiction book called The Black Count. And it's all about the entire story of Alexandre Dumas's father, who was like a colonel in Napoleon's army and rose all the way up through to the rank of like one of Napoleon's major generals, despite all of the hatred and anger towards him. Like, that's how big of a deal he became. Dumas comes out of that family that's just sort of this like openly black family that lives inside of French royalty and just sort of thumbs their noses at all of it and is just defiantly existing in French society despite all odds. And I love the fact that Dumas is still one of the most loved writers in literature, classic literature. He's still in canon, right? Mainly because most people don't even realize that he's not white. And academia almost never formally reviews or engages with his work. And yet readers continue to keep him in print to this day, and he keeps being remade and loved throughout all of this time. So like, that dude is just one of my personal heroes, because there's so many different vectors in which he should not be so widely read. And yet he's just out there just sort of defying everything. So Alexander Dumas is just like this sort of personal hero of mine. So there's just a few flourishes in there, paying respect to him. But the biggest homage is that I'm having a conversation with, Ray Bradbury, if I could be so bold. Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451, the famous novel about the firemen who burn all the books. And at the end of it, the way in which people are going to keep literature alive is they're going to memorize all of these famous texts, all these famous books from canon, and everyone will memorize a chapter, and they can kind of like run away and live in cells and keep books alive. That's the end of Fahrenheit 451. And everyone cites that in literature as like a hopeful end to the book, right? Like, because we're going to keep the flame of literature alive.
Okay.
And I was completely horrified as a kid when I read that, because I'm ADHD. And I'm like, I can't remember things for squat, right? Like, I can't remember the lyrics to my favorite songs. I can't remember stuff like my mom told me to get at the store when I'm showing up there, right? Like, I'm useless, right? Everyone's like, if you could just try harder at school, you could memorize these things and get good grades. And I would try real hard and completely fail. And so I get to the end of Fahrenheit 451, and I'm like, literature's just dead, because I don't understand that it's easy for, or other people can memorize things. I'm just like, literature's dead at the end of this book, as far as I'm concerned. It's a horror novel, right? And then two, I had a teacher in second grade that had us play the telephone game. So I had like this educated into me this anti this negativeness towards oral tradition, because she had us play the telephone game, and the message got warbled all the way by the time it got to the last person in the row of the class. And she was like, that's why you can't trust rumors. That's why you can't trust things that people say. I get what she was trying to do. She's trying to get us to stop talking so many rumors on the playground. But, she's like, this is why you can't trust, basically oral tradition. And that's the message I took away from it. I was just like, oh yeah, stories people tell get warped out of, craziness. And so for me, when I got to the end of Fahrenheit 451, I just thought literature was dead. Plus, no one would tell my crappy science fiction adventure stories. Like, they'd only want to like memorize Hemingway or Moby Dick, right? But some crappy Star Trek novel that I loved wasn't going to get memorized by anybody, right? So I just was like, this novel depressed me. Even though I loved Ray Bradbury, it just depressed me. And so I've always carried that within me as this fear, until I was talking to a man by the name of Ray Pearson. He's a biblical scholars professor over at Ohio Northern University, nearby where I live. And he was over at my house for dinner, and we were getting into this talk because I wanted to know his I love specialists, right? Whenever I find someone is deeply embedded in a field, I immediately ask them a billion questions about what they do and what they understand about their field. And so he starts telling me about sort of the differences between scribal and oral tradition, right? And he works in those complexities. And he works, of course, as a biblical scholar in some of the scribal stuff. As translations and copying introduces changes, right? He's learned that biblical texts have changed over time, even if they were in the same language. And so they study some of this stuff. And I was just like, oh, that's fascinating. I didn't realize that happened with scribal stuff. And he was like, yeah, it's not set in stone. Unless it's set in stone. And even when it's set in stone, it changes over the years. And then he's talking about that. And then he talked to me about the fact that oral tradition actually is really good, because he also studies something called biblical conversation theory studies, about how oral tradition gets passed down and turned into scribal tradition. And one of the things he told me was that inside of communities, there's something called, I forget what he calls it, but it works just like a checksum on a computer program. The community has heard the story many times. He's like, you have to remember the community is there. Oral tradition doesn't just happen from individual to individual to individual like it does in the row at school that you were in. It's told out loud to a class full of people, and everyone hears it. And the next time someone tells the story, you've got hundreds of people who've heard the story before. And if that guy makes a mistake, or woman, when they're telling the story, the community says, no, that's not right. You're misremembering it. He really goes up to this land with the spear and does this. Get it right. And the person telling the story has to go, oh, I'm sorry, and retell it right. Okay, so the community acts as this sort of communal reservoir that will check you if you get the story wrong. And actually, oral tradition is so good that there are oral stories that have been told by the people in Australia, the First Nations tribes in Australia, who have remembered that there are little islands or a volcano that was active at the end of this bay that's now underwater, that hasn't been seen for a long time, that indicates that story was told 10,000 years ago and it's
Wow.
passed down accurately. And so they've actually used it for some global warming studies to find out where some underwater features were above water 10,000 years ago in Australia. So that's the strength of an oral tradition.
I mean, you've just taken my last question and thrown it out, so I'm gonna have to conclude another one really quickly. Maybe I'll just throw it back to Roger. Because yeah, I was just going to ask about like why you wanted to address it, but I think you've done it beautifully because we see that kind of those oral traditions in exactly the way you just described in the novel. So
Yeah.
it's it's really wonderful to hear how authors come to the kind of bits that we love in a book.
It's, I always feel bad talking about like when people are like, how did you get the idea for a book, to people who haven't read the book yet? Because I'm like, it always sounds so academic and geeky. It's like, yeah, I was studying like, the second law of thermodynamics and playing with equations. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, it'd be funny if we changed the equation in a different universe so it worked like this. And then anyway, that's how I wrote this adventure about these pirates that like,
I was just going to say that a different question I could ask actually is like, how does it go from that kind of really kind of, if you don't mind me saying, slightly geeky interest in these things that kind of you clearly kind of really drilled down into and got really into, but your writing is really not hard academic stuff. It's fun and it's light and it's really easy to read and it's a joy to read and it's very layered and textured, right? So Paula, I think, spoke about having read books on the second and third time. And I similarly have kind of not tried to go back, but gone back to it and picked up more things every time. What's your journey from sort of having this kind of left of field or even not left of field idea and then actually producing a published novel? Like, how long is that journey and what does it look like?
It can be all over the place. I mean, I've written novels extremely fast, right? I don't think it's any surprise to the universe that like when the Halo novels that I'm kind of more known for, that I wrote in the Halo universe of the video game, those are on a tighter deadline, right? It's just sort of like you're working with people who have strong deadlines that are like, you've signed a contract that says you're going to have us a book by this time. You have to have a book by that time. There's no kind of artists like, no, I was struck by inspiration and I need 3-4 months. No, that doesn't happen. So those are like these definitely short, tight deadlines. And so that's where you're going from like, coming up with an idea, showing an outline, turning it in, executing, and then, you have your 4 to 6 months to write a book. It's very tight. The other stuff all happens all over the place. This book, the idea, the genesis for it came like 10 years ago, where the idea of our main character just dropped in my head, where I was like, I want to write about this young princess who lives in this land of plenty, but where they've captured the plenty and are controlling it. I'm very interested in this idea. Again, this is where how geeky it is. I've been reading these articles about regulatory capture. Businesses, for example, like Nestle, right, that will go to a spring in Florida and get the rights to the mineral water for $100 a year on a token lease from the government, and then they will be the only bottlers allowed to bottle the spring water that they then sell in a bottle for $2 a pop, and no one, I don't get to get access to that, and so just by being there and sitting on it, they get control of it. And so I've been reading all these examples of it, and so I wanted to create this world where we didn't have to, but then people still kind of landlord, um, because they can, and just someone living in that world and realizing that their parents were doing that and how they felt about it. Because I think that mirrors how we feel sometimes when we find out that like, oh, like these clothes that I just purchased are made by a child in Bangladesh, and I'm not comfortable with that. So then what is my reaction to that? Right? Because a lot of people I talk to are then like, what am I supposed to do with that? And I'm like, that's a great question. Like, I know what I'm going to do with that, but like some people are generally just kind of befuddled. So let's write a novel about someone who has to come face up with that and decide what they want to do with it. Right? Because maybe that's, this is what I said. This is about human beings talking to another human being. I don't think an AI could come up with this, because what AI will sit there and think like, how does that feel for another human being to go through this process? And maybe I can connect with other human beings by writing about this process. Like that's where it comes from. And then the next thing I have to do is find a character and a dilemma. I think it's really important to find the kind of tension that's at the heart of the narrative. And so for me, it was kind of like this idea between received wisdom and reasoned wisdom that you were asking me about, right? I kind of was interested in this idea of what if their world was kind of upside down from ours, where things that we would think are made up were true for them, and vice versa, right? And so that I could show that like actually what matters is their ability to look for truths regardless of what they'd been told, because that to me is the really interesting part of science. It's not so much the facts that are collected or the beliefs that exist. It's that simple little mechanism of, I propose a theory and I say that if the theory is right and I run this experiment, X result will happen. And if Y result happens, then I will have proven my theory wrong and I have to accept that as an answer. That's all science is. It's that little loop, right? And for, people can say it's this or this story or argue about, whether it should be right, but that's all science is. I propose this. If it's true, we should see this. And so that's what my characters are learning, right? Like, if the received wisdom is true, then they should see this, and they don't. And having to come to realization that, like, actually everything we've been taught may be wrong. That's just an interesting kind of sort of crux. So when I can find that, then it's just like, what are the ways in which I can dramatize this so that the characters go through this experience? And then you start looking for, okay, what are the things I have in the setting? What are some things I can do to put them into these situations? So when I started the novel, it was actually unusual. I usually heavily outline my projects. This was begun with just a handful of dilemmas. I charted out 5 or 6 different dilemmas that the characters would experience, and then just tried to find ways to steer the characters to those dilemmas.
Guess what? Did you have a follow up?
No, I
Oh,
was mumbling to myself. Wow, that's really interesting. Um,
I could talk a little bit more about that, because, like, for those of you who are reading or watching this because you're interested in becoming writers, there's this great tension where in most quote unquote Western humanities traditions that talk about literature and how to construct literature, talk about the importance of conflict, right? It's like, you got to have conflict in a story, and the conflict is what drives narrative, and that creates tension and movement and plot, right? But the more I come from a background where when I was a kid, I would go to these aunties who would have these storytelling sessions in Carriacou, where they would talk about Anansi tales. They would tell these stories, these oral tradition stories that were just really amazing and fascinating, and not necessarily driven by conflict, right? And then I'm starting to look at the fact that, like, there are these other storytelling traditions in China and in Japan. I find out about this thing called Kisho Tenketsu, which is used in Japanese manga comics, and explains why the first time I watched one of the who's the great animator, the Japanese animator.
that guy who did that the
Yeah,
studio.
Studio Ghibli.
There you
The
go.
first time I see a Studio Ghibli film, it's really confusing to me because it doesn't follow traditional conflict narrative, right? It was like, wow, this is really slow, and yet I am absolutely entranced by it and will not look away. And yet, this is not at all how I was taught plot was supposed to work. And yet, why am I still strangely entranced by this and not willing to look away, right? And so you go and you look, and there's a whole different theory of how to create plot in Japanese storytelling traditions. And you're like, okay, obviously, this tradition that we have going all the way back to Socrates, that it has to be conflict, comes out of this conflict-oriented, patriarchal, Greco-Roman kind of seed, right? And yet we still are saying that's the only way you can tell a story. But that really effectively silences so many stories of survival, which are often stories of minorities within Western culture, stories of women who are surviving in kind of rough situations, right? Oh, those don't have conflict in them, so they're not proper literature, right? And then, of course, non-Western stories, oral tradition, just so stories, myth, legend, right? All of that is just erased by this definition of what storytelling is, right? So it fails the test of what kinds of stories do I encounter in my life, and have I encountered in my life, and what are their vehicles, their narrative vehicles. So as I'm looking at this and thinking about, like, I'm starting to have to, like, work with students and talk to them about their own theories of literature, and they're like, conflict, 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 and looking for conflict. And I'm also looking around and seeing some cinema and going, like, oh, these two characters were talking to each other and having a beer, and now they're having a fist fight. Why? And it's like, oh, someone heard we need conflict in here to drive the story, and now there's just these people suddenly know judo, right? So it's kind of like, oh, you start seeing these things where you're like, oh, people are dropping into this lazy conflict theme, and yet there's also all this other stuff that's not conflict driven, that is great storytelling, because I loved hearing these stories when I was a child, and I love Studio Ghibli. So what is this? What is the bigger thing? And the bigger thing, I think, is hard choices, dilemmas, and interesting choices, right? If you look at choice as a story vehicle, you can kind of line up maybe more like 95% of different of humanity's storytelling, rather than just conflict, which does only about 30 to 40% of our storytelling. And I think choice gives you more narrative vehicles and more narrative things to do than just conflict, right? Hard choices means you can put people together who still have to make hard choices, who can share value systems, but still have differing choices based on those same value systems. You can tell stories of quiet survival with hard choices. You can tell myth, legend, magic. You can tell very different stories. You can tell stories of people who are just trying to survive. All of these kinds of stories, when you start thinking about choice as a narrative vehicle, start to open up for me, at least. And so I've been working with choice more than conflict, as a result of thinking about that oral tradition as well, and looking at like how prevalent it is across society. And if you think about it, think about the next time a friend of yours tells a really, really interesting story. You'll notice a couple things about it. A friend of mine was studying oral tradition live. And so he went around and he videotaped all of these hunters, because we're here in the American, Midwest. He interviewed all these hunters telling hunter stories, but it could just as well be fishermen telling fishing stories. You've seen this in action. The story is told in past tense, leading up to the events of the story, switches into present tense, leading up to the moment. And a really good story told by a friend of yours always leads up to a really hard choice that they have to make.
Mm.
And that is non-conflict based storytelling. It's always like, and there I was sitting in the blind with a, six pack of Bud Light in one hand and, an arrow in the other. And there comes this like 7-foot tall buck. And I thought, save the bear, or, and like a good story should be something you can stop at the moment before you tell them what happened. And everyone is leaning forward going, and, right? That's a good story, and that's all about hard choice, right? A really good ad I remember that I used to talk to my students about this is the one where it's a couple of college students, and they're ringing in all of their stuff at the grocery line, and they're just a little bit over, and the cashier looks at them, and there's a thing of beer and the toilet paper are the two things that are left, and they have to choose between them, and the college students are looking back and forth and back and forth, and she goes, paper or plastic? And they all go, paper, and they grab the beer, right? Like, that's a story. It's a hard choice, right? They had a hard choice. They made it.
So we're almost out of time, but I have one question that I want to ask you about religion. Some of us thought this novel quarrels with religion, while others of us thought the novel's quarrel is with dogmatism. Which conclusion is closer to what you intended the novel to convey?
I was hoping to convey more dogmatism. I was hoping to be, gentler on religion, but it is a bit, aimed at science and the science cycle. So it's a little hard on received wisdom, which religion can be. But it was more dogmatism that was interesting to me, because it's dogmatism that I find frustrating. I'm not religious myself, but I've lived happily in heavily religious contexts that are non-dogmatic. And I've been really uncomfortable in dogmatic secular contexts. So what I want is non-dogmatism and openness, and multiculturalism, and just that experience of there are lots of us stuck on an island together and we have to get along.
I have one more question. I'm so sorry. I have to ask.
Uh,
We've really enjoyed A Stranger in the Citadel, and for me, as a coming of age story, it was a really interesting ending. Can we expect a sequel? And if not, because I understand that not all writers want to write a sequel just because I want to have a sequel, what can we expect next from you?
If I were to write a sequel, and I haven't seen the sales numbers on Stranger yet. It's only been out for a year, and publishing moves is like glacial molasses in terms of those things. If I were to write a sequel, if there was demand for it, I have just a vague idea, and this is how these things work. Like I told you, I have an idea of a bunch of people who have just an archangel's head on kind of like an altar that they carry around that are living out in the desert, and it's been guiding them on a journey, and sort of like almost like Moses out in the desert, because I am playing with a lot of religious symbolism when I play with these novels. I wanted to set them in Mesopotamia because so many of the powerful religions that influence us today come out of that region. So I wanted some of those resonances. The opening line is, "Thou shalt not suffer a librarian to live." That I'm definitely playing with the world of my childhood, which was going to Anglican church and hearing a good homily. There's just something to a really good King James, "Thou shalt not suffer." I have this idea of them carrying it around almost like the Ark of the Covenant, around this desert, on this journey across the desert, and that's all I have is that image. And where I want to go with that, I don't know. But I have the image really, it's seared into my head the way the opening image of this book was seared into my head 10 years ago. So who knows? It may become real because there is a seed that's been growing in my head of that image. And so every once in a while, a new thing suggests itself to me, another image, a scene, a variation, and I just put it into my notebook, my little day book of things that are related to that idea. Right, I just have it called Archangel's Head. That's just the working title right now. That's not going to be what I call it. And so every time a new idea comes, I just open up the Archangel's Head text document and throw the idea in there. And so there are like 3 or 4 rough ideas about them wandering in the desert, and I kind of want to see where it cooks. So who knows? Maybe in 10 years we'll be discussing the second thing that comes out of this. I don't know.
I hope we
It's a
are.
weird business.
Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to the finished product.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today.
Thank you.
The next time our viewers see us, we'll be reflecting on Nalo Hopkinson's Black Hat Man. But
It's a good book.
before we, I like that you like it. But before we go, we're going to have a reading by Tobias. Thank you for joining us and have a lovely day.
I am Tobias Buckell, and I'm reading to you from A Stranger in the Citadel. The gods say, "You shall not suffer a librarian to live." I knew those holy words well, even as far from the center of the world as Nineveh was. But I truly didn't understand the weight of them until I saw the man in the jagged brown and red patterned cloak brought by his bound hands across the sandy mud under the Afrit Gate's arches, where the lions, carved from the stone, glared at the boundary between the wastelands and the city. The 7 herders around the stranger yanked at the ropes that they usually yoked their goats with as they pulled him into the city. "Stop that!" I shouted. The captured man's hair looked like a ragged bush. Clearly, he'd walked the wastelands for far too long. It bobbed in the air as he stumbled, as the herders ignored me and forced him along. "He's a traveler," I yelled, and travelers deserved hospitality. They deserved to be treated like treasured family members. So few of them ever came over the far horizon of sand that stretched all around Nineveh. We didn't want them to return to their own lands with stories about Nineveh's barbarity. As one of the daughters of the Lord Musketeer of Nineveh, I had to make sure our actions represented the honor of our city and my father. My duty here was plain. "Leave him be." "This is no traveler," one of the herdsmen spat. The stranger pulled back against them and tried to stand. Some of the herders yanked back on the 2 ropes around his neck to choke him until his eyes streamed with tears. Another jumped in between the ropes and hit the man in the chest with a heavy wooden crook. I heard the thud from a fall a street's width away as I walked toward the small crowd. I said, "Stop that." I imitated my father's cold, hard voice. I tried to act as if the fact that my order would be followed was as foregone a conclusion as he would, but the small mob didn't respond. "She said, 'Stop it,'" said Kira, who was standing to my right. She stepped forward and swept her hands free of her bright green robes to point at the other 2 bodyguards who were following me. The herders paused to look over at us with a bit more attention, and their faces twisted with fear as they recognized Kira. "Guardian, we found him out by the eastern grazes," one of the herders said, raising his arms and backing away from the beaten captive. Another herdsman dropped to his knees in front of me and held a bundle of fabric up to us. He tried to capture one of our goats, and he carried this with him. Kira sliced the twine around the bundle with one of her long daggers, then slid it softly back into its leather sheath. It's, one of the herders started. A book, Kira said, loathing clear in her voice. She dropped it to the ground as if it had burned her hands. We all stepped back away from the paper that flapped in the wind as the pages rustled about. I stared at the book. It felt so wrong to be in the middle of the street near something so forbidden. Burn it, Kira ordered one of the guardians.